Welcome back to the channel and to another episode of DIY Garage, and today I'll be showing you how I conduct a cylinder compression test. Let's jump right in. When should you conduct a cylinder compression test? Well, short answer, you can do it whenever you want. You can do it to your perfectly fine car. However, traditionally they are conducted when something foreign is found in the oil, in the water, if they're overheating, if the engine is really old, or maybe it's a pre-purchased inspection. It could be for a number of reasons, but they are usually the main ones. Tools. Every job you do, you have to have tools. In this case, we're going to need a compression tester. You want your compression tester to contain a gauge, a hose, and a way of screwing into your spark plug holes. Following that, you will need basic tools, screwdrivers, sockets, spanners. In my case, I'll need Allen keys as well to take out the coil packs. However, depending on what car you have, depends on how complex it will be to get access to the plugs. However, 9 times out of 10 shouldn't be too hard. As you can see here, there's a few things missing in the engine bay, but that's okay because you don't actually need a running engine to conduct a cylinder compression test. As long as you have a starter motor hooked up that can turn the engine at starting speed, you're good to go. However, regardless of whether your engine is running or not, you still need to disconnect your ignition and fuel system. Now, you could get away with just disconnecting the ignition system, taking your plugs out, and away you go. However, fuel will still be getting injected into the engine and may spray up into your surrounding environment and land near a spark plug or on you, which is not ideal. So it is best practice to disconnect both the ignition and the fuel system. So we're going to jump right in and do that. Once you've got your coil pack cover off, if your car has one, before you even pull out any plugs, always clean in and around where they are, because the last thing you want is any dust, debris or shit to fall into your cylinders when you pull your plugs out, because if that happens, you're gonna have a big problem. Pro tip, if you want to expedite the process, you can remove the spark plugs with a small rattle gun. Again, be very careful as the top of the spark plug is porcelain, and if the spark plugs go over the top of the cylinder head like my Skyline here and you break a spark plug, you're going to have to clean all that stuff out so it doesn't go into the cylinder. Likewise, you can put them back in with the rattle gun. However, with any bolt anywhere on your car, always screw them in by hand first to make sure the thread is going into where it is supposed to be. Following that, do not rattle them home like it's your wheel nuts. Screw them in till you hear a little bit of tension, then take off the rattle gun and do them by hand or use a torque wrench. When removing your spark plugs, make sure that the cylinder you remove it from is the order that you put them in. For example, spark plug out of cylinder 1 goes first, cylinder 2 goes second, so on, so on. So when it comes to looking at the plugs for any clues or hints as to what may be going on in the cylinder, you can compare the right plug to the right cylinder. Now that the plugs have been removed, let's look at them. So as you can see, this one here is relatively clean, but it does have some rust down the bottom. That is because this used to have a vented bonnet and water gets into the engine bay, into where the coil packs and spark plugs are, and sits there. I guess when it comes to modifying cars, you need to think about these things. Here is an old but reliable chart that compares spark plugs and different symptoms you may see on them, which will help you diagnose potential problems you may have going on inside your engine. Now we look inside the compression tester kit. Inside is very simple. There'll be a few things. You'll have some brass adapters, you'll have a hose, a gauge, and 2 other attachments. These are for different kinds of engines. However, all you should focus on, or really need to focus on, again, depending on the engine that you have, are these 2 here. You have your pressure gauge, and you have the hose that connects to the pressure gauge, like so, just clips on. And then this screws into where your spark plugs used to be. Now, with your brass adapters, you need to find one that screws into the same spark plug hole as yours. for me, it will be this one here. So like so, very, very simple. You just screw it on to the edge here. It'll be a little O-ring. You don't want to squeeze it too tight, but you also don't want to be too loose. Just finger tight, that's enough. Now to the engine. Safety note, before conducting your cylinder compression test, if you have a manual car, make sure it is out of gear, in neutral, and the handbrake is pulled up tight. If you have an automatic car, make sure it is in park and the handbrake is on up tight. And if you're on a slope, make sure the wheels are chocked to prevent it rolling or moving backwards. Following that, if you have someone assisting you, which is highly probable, make sure that you communicate before cranking the engine in any way. That is to avoid yourself or the person helping you getting injured, whether it's their sleeve, hair, or something else, getting caught in the moving parts of the engine. Because remember, no matter what you're doing, safety is important. So now you want to feed the compression test hose with your preferred adapter for the spark plug hole and screw it in like so. And once it's tight, you want to go finger tight. So just grab it and give it a little bit of a twist because you want to seal that O-ring, but you do not want to squish it. Then you grab your gauge, pull back little clip and slide it on like so. Voila, that's all you have to do. But before we start, you are going to need paper or cardboard of some kind and a texter. You're probably thinking, why am I going to have that? Well, you want to write your cylinder numbers down. So it's going to be cylinder 1, cylinder 2, cylinder 3, 4, 5, and 6. Then below that, you're going to have the dry test and then the wet test. Now the wet test is what you will use the oil bottle for. That is all you need to write down. And before I move on, as I've mentioned and harped on many times before, safety is important. So for this, it is recommended that you wear gloves, as I have in my hands here, and have some form of eye protection. This is in case dust or debris, fuel, or of the like gets shot out of the cylinders. So, safety goggles like so. I should probably get some proper ones. These are, some would say, a bit of an overkill. And as you know, with my particular setup here, of course the car is still getting put together, I'm gonna have to jump start it with this screwdriver. I do not recommend that, but in this case, that's what we're gonna do. So, grab your gauge, press the button on the side, make sure there's no air in it. And now, when you crank it, when you do anything with this kind of testing, you want it to be consistent. So if you crank it for 5 times on cylinder 1, do the same for cylinder 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or however many cylinders you have. So now, I want to go through and crank for cylinder 1 testing. Noticed how I cranked it for 7 times, so now I need to follow suit with all the cylinders. Now let's look at the gauge. As we can see on the gauge here, it is reading just under 125 psi. Each little dash in between the numbers is 5 psi, so this will be 120 psi for cylinder 1. Now we will move on and conduct the wet test. Now you want to press on the side, release all the air, disconnect the gauge and unscrew the compression hose. So what we'll be doing now, as I unscrew this, is we'll be getting our handy little oil bottle here and we'll be putting oil into the cylinder. Now this oil will then go and seep around the rings of the piston, and this is to replicate when the engine is running and there is oil in the cylinders. Now with the wet test, you will always get a higher reading, so do not stress. And then essentially what you do across the board is once you've done all 6, you will then compare your readings, but we'll touch on what is acceptable later. Again, keeping everything consistent, so we feed the tube into the cylinder and we press once, 2, 3, 4. Now, same as before, screw the compression hose back in, but point to note, you want to do this quick. You don't want to leave it too long because the oil will eventually seep out of the cylinders. Like if you do this cylinder straight away and then do the next one, but then wait 10 minutes, you might not get an accurate reading. Gauge back on. Now this time I'm going to show you the gauge moving as I crank it so you can see how it moves and get familiar with that. As we can see, a much higher reading of 140 psi, which is 15 psi more than the dry test. Now I will go through and do the rest of the cylinders and then we will compare the numbers and review them. So I just finished the final cylinder and the numbers are interesting, both wet and dry testing, but good from an educational standpoint, which is what we're here for. So now I will run through the numbers with you from each cylinder, both wet and dry, and then what the acceptable variants are. Cylinder 1 dry test was 120 psi, the wet test 140 psi, cylinder 2 dry test 132 psi, wet test 155 psi, cylinder 3 dry 135 psi, and wet 160 psi, cylinder 4 dry test 137 psi, and wet 156 psi, cylinder 5 again 137 psi and wet 160, cylinder 6 dry was 128 psi and wet test was 155. As you notice, there are some measurements in there that aren't in units of 5, and even though the gauge is measured in units of 5, sometimes the needle will just land in between, so then you got to look at it and test and adjust and work it out from there. Now these are the accepted tolerances. With the dry test variant, the highest reading was 137 psi and the lowest reading was 120 psi. Now the percentage variation came to a total of 12.4%. This does fall within the generally acceptable 10 to 15% range. However, it is on the higher side, so it does indicate some wear or something of that effect in cylinder 1. With the wet test variation, the highest reading was 160 psi and the lowest was 140 psi, again in cylinder 1. Now the percentage variation came to a total of 12.5%. Again, this falls within the generally acceptable range, but it is still on the high percentage side, which would indicate some sort of issue with cylinder 1. But remember, always refer to your manufacturer specifications, as each engine is different. What causes low compression in an engine? Well, quite a lot of things. Can be from poor timing, warped or cracked head, a blown head gasket, could be burnt or worn valves that are no longer seating properly, worn or cracked piston rings, damaged pistons, damaged cylinder walls. And even if an engine is really old, it will naturally lose compression over time because parts wear out. Now the caveat with this engine is it's been rebuilt twice. So I don't know what's going on. However, with your engine, if it has similar readings like this, or you want to do additional testing, one thing you can do is a leak down test, which I'll put that video up here. If I haven't released it yet, then it won't be up there yet. So that is what you can do. I'll do a video on that. But that is essentially how you conduct a cylinder compression test on your engine. It is as simple as that. It shouldn't take you more than half an hour, maximum 40 minutes. And I'll continue to do DIY videos from servicing to compression tests through to molding GDR overfenders on a Skyline, or building an engine, or upgrading suspension, race cars, all that kind of stuff happening right here on the Jonesy Express in DIY Garage. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.